After an attack by a notorious treasure hunter known only as the Black Manta, local lighthouse keeper Thomas Curry was rushed to the emergency room. In recent days, Thomas Curry has denied marine biologist Dr. Stephen Shin's claims that his son is an Atlantean. But in a world of Batman, Superman, and Wonder Woman, stranger things have been proven fact. Inside of the hospital, Tom Curry lies in bed. Oxygen tubes rest in his nose, and electrical monitoring devices are scattered across his chest. His son, Arthur, sits by his side, clearly distraught. "They know, Dad," he says. "Dr. Shin told them who I am. How could he do this?" Weakly, Tom says that there's something Arthur needs to do for him when he's gone. Arthur tries to protest, hoping that his dad will be okay, but Tom is firm. He asks his son to listen, and the young man leans in to hear the whispered words. Tom tells Arthur to go to the oceans, find Atlantis, find your mother for me, tell her that I loved her, tell her that I never stopped. I never stopped. And then he's gone. We see Arthur linger for a moment, holding on to his father's hand, and then we cut to the lighthouse. We've seen this moment once before. The paparazzi have surrounded the house. Thanks to his enhanced hearing, Arthur can hear them all clearly, even when they're locked outside. The noise of their questions, their insensitivity to his feelings, the betrayal that he's gone through, and the loss of his father is all finally too much. Arthur smashes open the door, saying that he isn't one of them, and he tears off his shirt. Dr. Shin shouts from the crowd, trying to get to Arthur in order to apologize, but the young man dives off of the cliff and into the ocean below. My name is Ben, and this is Comic Book Breakdown, episode 26.9 of Aquaman, The Prodigal Son Journeys. Welcome back, folks, to Arthur Curry's past with issue 0 of Aquaman. After a year of publishing the New 52 line of titles, DC decided to do a little mini event / stunt in order to refocus the eyes of the comic buying world upon them. The New 52 was, in general, a terribly uneven publishing line with inconsistent continuity between titles. A few creative teams fell apart rather publicly very early on, and some creators or editors would answer questions at fan conventions as if those answers were canon to the comics, but then contradict those answers in the comics themselves. Sometimes not all press is good press, and so DC wanted to refocus the narrative on the good work that they were doing, and not the missteps that they had made along the way. To that end, DC took November of 2011 to publish a 0 issue of all of their titles. Whatever normal numerical issue that would have been published that month got pushed back a month, and this was released in its stead. Every 0 issue would explore a story that happened in the past, before this publishing line began. Some books took this as a chance to set up ideas that they would then explore later, or to clear up continuity issues, or to examine their main character. For DC in general, this was a chance to show that the weird background continuity gap that they had created was actually a source for more good stories, and not the black hole of problems that fan reaction had turned it into. In the actual reading order of Aquaman comics, issue 0 should be placed before issue 13, which I covered last episode because it fit the overall narrative of the Others story arc better. But the issue 0 does explore a previously unexplored part of Arthur's history, it introduces some important characters to the narrative, and it sets up the story that is going to dominate the book for the next several months. It is a must-read for this run, and a lot of 0 titles published before or outside of this event, sometimes you can kind of skip over, but not this time. Before I talk about the opening scene of this particular comic, I would like to say that I love the branding that DC did on the covers for these 0 issues. Each cover features a page of the comic as its background, but with no colors. It is all black and white. For Aquaman, it's the page of him with his dad as he is dying. The center of that black and white image then has a hole punched through it, from which the main character, or the team, if it's that kind of book, is exploding outward. It's meant to indicate that from the past comes these vibrant characters and their exciting stories. The sheer volume of this type of cover on a new comic shelf at your local store would be very striking, too, clearly indicating that something was going on with DC's comics. And maybe, as a reader, you would pick up more than one issue of these comics to see if there was a connected storyline going on. And since these issues are set in the past, they work as a pretty good introduction to each book, so they do make a fairly nice jumping on point. If you are worried about it, there is no connective tissue between these issues as part of the 0-month event. Each title is a single standalone issue, so don't worry your little heads. If you read one book, you're perfectly fine, and if you read all of the books, you're also perfectly fine, but there is no connective tissue going on here. There is no 0-month story that connects all 52 of these comics. It's just single issues. Obviously, author Jeff Johns has a pretty solid setup here. He's established that Arthur spent some time after the death of his father in the ocean and globe-trotting already. That's how the others came to be, after all, and we just spent a whole story arc exploring them. But we know very little about that era, in fact, or how Arthur found Atlantis, or how Atlantis accepted him, or challenged him, or just anything about it. There is a lot of ocean to cover in Arthur's past, and so it makes sense to start here, with the death of his father and him leaving to go explore that ocean. Arthur leaving the surface world isn't just a rejection of humanity now, although I certainly think that is a part of it for him. No, Arthur has been given a quest to find his mother and tell her that his dad still loved her. This really helps to fit with the idea that Arthur is an adventurer, not a superhero necessarily. He isn't going in the ocean to save anything with this story. He's fulfilling a sacred quest given to him on his father's deathbed. We also have a small but important bit of information given to us in this scene, that characters like Superman, Batman, and Wonder Woman are known by the general public and they are a recent development. I spoke about this a bit in the setup episode for Aquaman, that in a world without super people, Aquaman is unique, powerful, and pretty interesting. In a world with super people, though, Aquaman is... well, I mean, he's another one, right? Even the reporter giving us this information is like, this is weird, sure, and it might be true. But they aren't amazed at the fact that Arthur could be Atlantean. They aren't flabbergasted. There is no huge investigation going on into whether or not Atlantis is real. It's just one more thing. Aquaman, as far as the public is concerned, isn't all that important, which jives with Johns' portrayal of the public's general reaction to Arthur in previous issues. As the credits for the issue begin to roll, we see Arthur just swimming in the ocean. The scenes read as freeing and beautiful to me. Arthur feels happy here. There's no more surface world problems, no more hiding who he is, no more pain and death haunting him, just weightlessness in the cool water. The beautiful, smooth movements of fish who school around him like old friends. But as Arthur leaves the relatively shallow waters of the shore for the deeper depths of the open ocean, things begin to get darker. The moonlight penetrates less. Sunken ships are grown over by coral and covered in debris. Black smokers spit hot ash into the water. The freedom of the initial panels has been replaced by an oppressive heaviness, like something is coming. From the darkness, a massive great white shark rises up at Arthur. He barely has time to react, just grabbing the shark by its jaws to keep them from closing on him. His hands do get cut open on the sharp teeth, and Arthur instinctively lashes out, punching the animal across the face. As it circles back around, in a panic, Arthur finally remembers to use his telepathy, and the beast calms down. It does take a moment of concentration, but Arthur drives off the shark and makes for the surface. The ocean is not as safe as Arthur thought it was. As he breaks the surface, he finds that neither is the surface. A huge storm throttles the sea, lightning flashing in cascading arcs overhead. A foghorn nearby sounds. Arthur whips his head around. He actually isn't that far from shore, and neither is a boat. He can hear his father's voice again, explaining that yes, he could captain his own ship, but someone has to watch the shores. Someone has to keep those ships safe. On the boat, we briefly see a father and daughter pair fighting the waves, but the waves are just too strong. A sudden push knocks the dad over, slamming his head into the railing. The boat streaks towards the jagged rocks of the shoreline, but then it stops. Between the boat and rocks is Arthur Curry. He pushes back against the very ocean itself, using his anger to save the boat. After the storm passes, the next day is beautiful and calm. White clouds fill the sky over calm blue ocean. The dad has recovered from his injury as best he can, and his daughter, Jane, with a Y, thanks Arthur. But where did he come from, she asks, and how did he save them? Arthur hesitates for a moment, but then figures why not. He says that his mother is from Atlantis. She's supposed to be its queen, and he's trying to find her, and even if it sounds crazy. Yeah, well, a lot of stuff sounds crazy lately, Jane says, referencing the news report at the top of the issue. Arthur goes on, saying that he's been searching for his mother for months. I've crisscrossed the ocean floor and found nothing, he says. Maybe Atlantis isn't even real. Maybe there's another explanation for why he can do what he can do. That's when Dad stands up. He knows of someone who says that Atlantis is real. It used to be just an old joke amongst his sailing buddies, but there was a man pulled from the water a while ago who claimed to be from Atlantis. He's gotta be the dad's age now, but maybe that's something. Last he knew, this guy was living in an old fishing village off the coast of Norway. They call him Volko. I really like the general idea of this pair of scenes. The delivery of them looks good, but it kind of lacks impact. The scenes where Arthur is swimming through the ocean and doing nothing else really works for me. Each panel has one of the credits for this issue in it, and that kind of forced me as a reader to slow down my reading pace. After all, I've seen a bunch of movies in my life, and I know the general speed that opening credits are introduced at. The camera lingers as a figure moves across the screen. It just sits with the credits for a few seconds, and I automatically found myself stopping to allow for that time here. These pages are presented with no dialogue. There's no inner monologue. There's no speech going on. It's just Arthur swimming in a mostly black ocean. So as a reader, you could just fly through these pages. ... Arthur fights a shark. Hooray, something cool's happening. But the credits kind of forced me to slow down. Even if I didn't take the time to read them, I automatically put myself in this kind of movie-paced opening. That echoes for us the idea that Arthur has been at sea for months, searching for Atlantis, but found nothing. We are supposed to slow down in this moment. We are supposed to lose track of time. Are these panels happening the night that Arthur left the surface? Or are they happening 6 months after? We have no idea, and that's the point. But, for me, it is a point poorly made. Arthur can breathe underwater, yes, but he was still raised on the surface. He still slept in a bed, and he had a roof over his head, and he ate prepared food, so how did he survive out in the ocean? Where did he sleep? How did he eat? I'm assuming that he could hunt easily thanks to his telepathy, but did he cook the fish? Or did he just eat them raw? There are definitely cultures around the world that subsist mostly on fish, both prepared and raw, but the United States isn't really one of them. And even in the first issue of this comic, when we saw Arthur go to a restaurant, he ordered fried fish. My point is that there should be some kind of culture shock going on here, and not seeing Arthur go through it does bother me. The whole point of decompressed storytelling in comic books is to take the time to examine a character's emotions more thoroughly. But Johns doesn't examine this concept at all, and that makes the pages feel like a moment passing by instead of months passing by. Arthur doesn't even grow facial hair, which would have been a super easy way to show the passage of time artistically. Aquaman with a beard is not a foreign concept. He definitely rocked one in the mid-90s. Or maybe the creative team could have had a series of small single panel shots of Arthur saving multiple boats, divers, and fisher people over this time, paired with newspapers, right, to show the passage of time. Maybe Dr. Shin is even the one who is collecting those news stories, which not only tells us what Arthur is doing and how long it takes, but it echoes the established idea that Shin tracked his movements, right? We've seen him with a stack of newspapers. Where did he get them? From these story incidents. What Johns did here works, for the most part, but I do think that the passage of time could have been demonstrated better, both in story and artistically. The creative team uses the Volko name drop to nicely transition us, and I love a nice transition, to the fishing village that he is mentioned being at. At the home of Volko, the older-looking man is unlocking his front door. We see someone say his name, Volko, and he turns to see Arthur standing behind him. Before Arthur can even introduce himself, Volko recognizes him. "He has her eyes," Volko says. "You're Arthur. At last there's hope." With tears in his eyes, Volko drops to a knee, bowing to Arthur. "The Queen's son is alive." Volko, by the way, looks like an older man for my audio audience. He is a bit wide, he's got a belly on him, but he wears it well. He is bald up top with a halo of medium-length black hair going around the sides of his head. He does have a thick black beard and mustache, too. I do not know how Atlanteans age, but I would say that he's probably in his late 40s or 50s, maybe. I mean, I have more gray hairs than this dude does, and as of this recording, I'm almost 40, so what do I know? Anyways, Volko tells Arthur that his parents met during the Raging Eye, capital R, capital E, a storm so large that it encompassed the entire mid-Atlantic Ocean. His father's boat was flipped over and it was about to sink, taking him with it, when he met Atlanta, Arthur's mother. It was love at first sight for both of them. When Atlanta learned that she was pregnant, she asked to be released from her duties to the throne so that she could go be with Tom. But Atlanta was imprisoned instead. By the time she finally did escape, she was almost at the end of her pregnancy. Arthur actually ended up being born while she was on the run, just off the coast of the United States. She managed to deliver Arthur to Tom for safekeeping, and then she returned to Atlantis. If Atlanta had stayed with Tom and Arthur, then Atlantis would have never stopped looking for them and being a present threat in their lives. Atlanta sacrificed her freedom and their future together as a family so that they could live in peace. But when she returned to Atlantis, Atlanta was forced into a political marriage to the captain of the Atlantean Guard. Eventually, she gave birth to a second son, this time one who was fully Atlantean. This was Arthur's half-brother, Orm, O-R-M. On Orm's 12th birthday, his father was killed, and his mother saw it as a chance to flee. Volko helped her plan a route that would reunite her with her love and her firstborn child. Atlanta even intended to take Orm with her and just start over. And then she was killed. Murdered, actually, the night of her escape. Volko suspects, but does not know for a fact, he suspects that it was her own son, Orm, who had it done. With her death, Orm became the king of Atlantis, after all. Volko publicly accused Orm of this act, but the loyalist tried to have him killed next. He barely escaped with his life, and for the last 10 years, he's lived here on the surface world. Recently, he began to see the news reports about the Aquaman from Atlantis, and it gave him new hope. He even tried to contact Arthur, but by then it was too late. He had already vanished. While Volko related all of this exposition to us and Arthur, he also searched through his home, finally producing a wide, thin box. He pulls out 2 things from it. The first is a map to the dead king's armory, where Atlantis' most powerful weapons are held, including the indestructible trident. We've seen a good bit of story dedicated to this idea already in some of the concepts surrounding the Dead King's Island. The second is a necklace decorated with blue and green jewels set in gold. These stones once sat upon the dead king's crown before it was destroyed, and they will act as a symbol that Arthur is the heir. Arthur then asks who the dead king was, and Volko says that he was the creator of and first king of Atlantis. As his biological descendant, Arthur is the rightful heir to the greatest society that the world has ever known. But Volko warns Arthur that Orm is as charismatic and smart as his mother, and as cruel and vicious as his father. With Arthur alive, though, Orm's harsh rule can finally come to an end. Atlantis can finally be free. Arthur isn't sure about that. Even if he really was the son of the queen and a descendant of a dead king, that doesn't mean that the people are going to accept him. Arthur doesn't say it, but he's already seen humanity fail to accept him for who he is. After all, he has good reason to doubt. But Volko assures him that Atlantis will accept him, and he puts the necklace over Arthur's head. They have to accept him. By law, he is the dead king's kin, and those are the only laws that Atlantis follows. He will be Atlantis' savior, and Volko's. Our people can be great again, he says, if they have a great leader. Arthur tries one more time to talk this old man down. He just came looking to talk to him about his mother. He didn't want a crown or a kingdom or to lead an insurrection. He just wants to pass along his father's message, maybe get to know his mom. Volko assures him that he can do those things, because his mother is buried at Atlantis. Dressed now in traditional Atlantean clothing and armor, we see Volko leading Arthur down into the ocean. As they swim, fish begin to follow the younger man. Volko explains that they're drawn to him. They know that he is the king. The people of Atlantis will react the same way. And then Arthur finally sees the city. His eyes go wide. Volko smiles. And so does Arthur. He has felt so alone for so long. He's honestly felt lost, but now seeing this, he's home, isn't he? Volko nods. Welcome to Atlantis, King Arthur. From now on, your life is here. We end the issue in a double-page vertical spread of Atlantis in all of its glory. So that was not what I was expecting from this issue. I don't know about y'all, but I kind of figured that this issue was going to tie together all of the historical plot points that author Jeff Johns has already established over the past 12 issues of this run. Like, sure, it would have had this moment of Arthur losing his dad and going to Atlantis could have been part of that, but I thought that maybe it would show more of his globe-trotting, like how he met the others, how he became the king of Atlantis, and why he left Atlantis, right? Covering all the stuff that happened up to the start of this series. And that is a lot of storytelling to do in a single issue, sure. I'm not saying it isn't. But the point of a zero issue is to be a good jumping on point, right? A summary of what this book is and what it is meant to be. So I think a short summary of Johns' take on Aquaman feels like it could have been the right concept for this issue, and that's clearly not what we got. As such, I am a bit disappointed, but I also believe in judging a creative work on what it is, not what I want it to be. So, setting aside my initial complaint that this isn't what I wanted it to be, what was it? How was it? And overall, this story is pretty straightforward and simple. Arthur's world on the surface has all died or betrayed him, pretty much, so he tries to find a new world in the ocean. And it's not what he expected. He fails to find Atlantis. He fails to find his mother. And oddly enough, the moments where Arthur seems most comfortable are those moments caught between the two environments, right? When Arthur saves the boat, it's almost an affirmation of his father's words. Someone has to protect the people caught between land and sea, and that person is Arthur. And as someone who has now read the story of his life 6 years in the future, we know that he becomes that hero. That is who Aquaman is. Arthur also finds Vulko, an Atlantean who is on the surface, which echoes the idea that Arthur's place isn't in either location. He is not solely land-based, and he is not solely based in the ocean, but he is caught in between. He finds the things that he needs and loves in both environments, and only when he chooses one place over the other does he really struggle. And this issue ends with him choosing one of them, so prepare yourself for some suffering, Arthur! That said, the meeting with Vulko is, well, it's a lot, right? He is an absolute fountain of historical knowledge as a former advisor to the throne, and the back half of the comic is essentially just a huge info dump by him. Some of it is information that we already knew the basics of, right? That Atlanta and Tom fell in love, that she had to leave, and that she never came back. Now we know a lot more about why those things happened, and it essentially boils down to Atlanta's responsibility to the throne of Atlantis. This is, of course, tragic, especially for our boy, Arthur, but it's not wholly unexpected either, right? As heir to the throne, Atlanta would have a responsibility to produce another heir of some kind, or her family would leave the power of the throne to someone else, and we don't know enough about Atlantean traditions or politics to guess who or what that could have been effectively. Given that Atlanta was forced into a political marriage in the end, though, I kind of don't see why her father couldn't just release her from the throne, and then the captain of the guard could have been named King's heir or whatever, and then life under the sea would have gone on beautifully, right? The ancient Romans would occasionally adopt outside of their bloodline to ensure an heir. Caesar did that, if I remember correctly. So, and she marries the dude anyways, right? She marries the captain of the guard to have Orm. Why not just go, Atlanta, go to the surface, it's fine. I'm going to adopt Captain of the Guard as my son. Captain of the Guard, go find a lady to get pregnant. That kid will become heir to the throne. But that's not what happened, is it, Ben? So Atlanta was forced to have a second kid, Orm. And technically, this bit of storytelling is actually our introduction to Orm. Remember, this issue was originally released before issue 13. Johns wanted us to learn that Orm might be a power-hungry, parent-killing type of guy. And then we would read issue 13, and he is suspected of being the one who wants the scepter. This issue kind of helps raise the stakes for issue 13, and all it takes is a single name being said. Orm, is that you in there? Arthur asked. And our eyes are supposed to widen with realization. Oh, Aquaman's crazy, maybe evil half-brother could be behind this whole plot with Black Manta? That's some pretty good writing. It also sets Orm and Atlantis up as our focuses for the next big story arc of Aquaman. This is the shifting in gears that I mentioned last episode. Up to this point, Johns has demonstrated that Aquaman is an adventurer, protecting the surface world largely from ocean-based threats, like protecting the town of Little Rock from the Trench, or protecting the others from Black Manta. But now, Johns is shifting his focus to Atlantis, and all of the problems, challenges, and history that it represents to Arthur. That is ultimately why I decided to move this issue separate, because it's such a strong gear change, and the Orm name drop, well, important and potentially influential, doesn't really play a role in the end of the other story arc. It just helps to continue to set up our next story arc. Because one of the weird things about this particular issue ending the way it ends is that we know Arthur isn't the king of Atlantis anymore. If Orm is his half-brother, then it stands to reason that Orm is currently the king of Atlantis, right? And if Arthur was okay with that, if he left Atlantis in the hands of Orm, then I wouldn't expect Orm to be that bad a guy, right? After all, why would Arthur trust the man who manipulated his people into killing his own parents so that he could rule an entire kingdom? Orm can't be that bad a guy, right? Come on. And to back up the idea that Orm might not be the villain of the next arc, notice that Volko, as important as he is in this issue, hasn't shown up at all in any of the comics that we've read so far. We could almost consider him like a third father figure to Arthur, almost replacing Atlanta in the role of Atlantean parent, right? But Arthur hasn't thought about him, or contacted him, or told anybody about him in the past 13 issues of this comic. Given how much Wikipedia information Volko just barfed up this issue, wouldn't it stand to reason that Volko might be someone who knows about the trench? Or might be someone who knows where the seventh relic was hidden, or how to find it? So what the floop happened to Volko? I also want to comment that I just don't like Volko's vibe here. He obviously considers himself wronged by Orm, given the story that he told Arthur and how he was driven out of Atlantis, and that's fine. But Arthur is a kid who can't even grow a beard yet, who is desperate to find some semblance of family right now, and he just washes up on Volko's doorstep, and in one afternoon, this guy has almost forced Arthur into a dangerous, life-threatening political situation. He just told Arthur that his half-brother may have had both of his parents killed, that his allies nearly killed Volko for talking about it, and that he's a cruel and callous leader, and he is forcing Artie to try to unseat this guy? Honestly, as far as I'm concerned, it is a miracle that Arthur managed to swim out of Atlantis with his head attached at all. And if Orm let Arthur rule Atlantis when he did show up, then who is really the bad guy here? Is Orm really that much of a monster? Or is Volko maybe a little bit more manipulative than he seems to be? Or maybe as manipulative as he seems to be, but maybe he is more evil than he seems to be, because he feels manipulative here. He just doesn't feel evil. Because remember, going into this issue, we have no reason to trust Volko. At least we have no more reason to trust him than we do to have Orm. For as straightforward as author Jeff Johns presents this issue, there's kind of a lot of unsettling, ominous stuff being set up for the next story arc. And I love it. I also really love the artwork for this issue. The pages of Arthur swimming in the Black Ocean could feel oppressive. I don't really think that's a bad read of them. Like, if that's how you took that scene, I think that that's completely valid and makes sense. But to me, they felt so freeing that nothing else in them mattered except Arthur, the act of swimming, and the occasional fish that he passed by. That's kind of amazing storytelling. And the coloring in this issue, oh my God, it's gorgeous. One of the things that I have been remiss in talking about in this comic so far has been colorist Rod Reis's habit of coloring the gutters. In comic book speak, the gutters are the space on a page that is between the panels of the comic. Most of the time in a comic book, the artwork happens inside of those panels. Those panels essentially contain the mini reality that you are experiencing as you read a comic book. Outside of those panels is generally left white, which contrasts nicely with the inking and colors inside. But Ivan Reis will often have a page with like 4 horizontal panels descending on it, and then one final splash image that exists outside of a box. There's just no box at the very end of the page. It's just a picture of like Arthur's head or Black Manta posing dramatically or what have you. So Rod Reis colors those panels, and then he bleeds the background of those colors up or down, if the case may be that, and he fills in the rest of the gutters on the page with them. This adds a sense of cohesiveness to the entire page. For example, there was a page in issue 13 when the crustacean ship thing breached the surface. That panel of the crustacean has no border, but it is rising to the surface in the middle of a storm with a dark sky above it, and the camera angle is looking up from below, so we, as the audience, are looking up at this thing. That not only makes the crustacean ship seem bigger and more imposing, but now we have to see the sky behind it, right? Rod Reis can't just skip out on a background here and show us a crab ship. So he bleeds a blue-gray sky all the way up the page of the comic and works in the effect of falling rain. This reinforces the idea that it is pouring out, and it's not just raining inside of the panels, but all around them as well, making it almost a 3D effect in our heads, but on a 2D page. Here in issue 0, when Volko kneels before Arthur, Ivan Reis uses almost 3/4 of the entire page to demonstrate this. This time, there is a panel in the image, but it is behind Volko and Arthur. It's framing them, putting them in the foreground. They stand, or kneel, in Volko's case, in front of the panel, making that space part of reality too. So now, Rod Reis colors the inside of the panel to add depth and texture and to help the eye focus on it. But he also colors the bottom of the page with murky splashes of green like wet, dirty grass, which fades as it goes up the page. This way, the darker green at the bottom of the page contrasts with the panel that is behind the men, and the white gutters at the top of the page still feel clean. It is a super pretty page to me, and I cannot applaud the work that Rod Reis has been doing on this book enough. This is one of the things that makes it hard to do the audio portion of the comic, is there's only so much I can say or describe about a page or a color and convey it verbally to an audience, right? So I'm trying my best here, folks. This is why I haven't talked about it a lot, and I wanted to just take a moment to remind y'all that, like, this is a really pretty comic. It's just great. That moment with Volko, when he is relieved that Arthur is alive, also serves to cement what Arthur was just doubting only a page or two ago. Remember, in the very scene before this scene with Volko, Arthur told Jane that he is about to give up on believing in Atlantis. Maybe that was just a story that his dad told him. After all, the world has a Superman from space, a guy who dresses up as a bat, and an Amazonian Wonder Woman running around in it. Arthur could have gotten his powers from any number of sources that weren't Atlantis, this thing that everybody knows is fake, right? He had, up to this point in his own life, no good reason to believe that Atlantis was real, except for his dad's word. This moment when he meets Volko and Volko confirms that all of this stuff is real is a big moment for Arthur. And artistically, it is sold to us as this big momentous moment of Volko kneeling. Again, it takes up 3/4 of the page, but it doesn't feel like a big moment when I read it. One of the biggest problems that I have been finding myself having with Geoff Johns' run so far, and this ties back into the reveal of Arthur's connections to Dr. Shin and Black Manta. One of the reasons that I've been having this problem with these moments is because Johns doesn't do any build to these reveals, nor does he take advantage of them nearly well enough. Take this one, right? It's meant to be this big moment, confirming at last that Atlantis is real, that Arthur is the son of Queen Atlanta, and that all of this nebulous, silly stuff that the surface world dismisses as fiction is true. That should be a thing in the story. But I've just read 13 issues of Aquaman that already confirmed that all of this was true. I was told in the first issue of this comic that Atlantis was real by no one less than Aquaman himself. I have seen him visit a crashed Atlantean craft. I have seen Atlantean warriors try to kill people in order to retrieve that A-glyph, and I know that Arthur has been the king of Atlantis. This moment with Volko is treated like it's a reveal, but it's not a reveal at all. It's just a repeat of what we already know, presented as dramatically as possible. Similarly, when Johns revealed the shared history between Shin, Manta, and Arthur, it didn't feel like a mystery solved because none of the setup for it was treated like it was a mystery. We were told that Arthur and Shin had some kind of rough past together, but we also saw Arthur contact Dr. Shin twice in our story, so whatever happened in the past, it couldn't have been that bad. And while the reveal that Arthur and Manta killed each other's dads is poetic and Shakespearean and epic, and I think those things and I agree with those things, it's also kind of hollow for me. I was not made to be invested in Manta's story at all. I don't know him as a person. I only know him as an unstoppable monster, able to hunt down superpowered humans and win. In fact, when Johns revealed that Arthur killed Manta's dad, personally, I kind of nodded. It made sense in terms of comics morality. Yeah, an eye for an eye, a dad for a dad. This is the second drawback to how Johns has told some of the story. Black Manta and Dr. Shin just don't have enough depth developed for me to be invested in their stories. My emotional investment in this story was Arthur. And granted, it is his comic book. That is where our focus should be, and Johns has excelled at telling that story. But if you want to play it that way, we still need to keep in mind that this reveal needs to either inform us of Arthur's behavior towards these two men, or change that behavior towards those two men. Dr. Shin, at least, has some depth, and I'll give Johns credit for that. We know that he and Arthur have hurt each other, but we have also seen them put that hurt aside in order to work together. So whatever betrayal was in their history, it has begun to heal, at least a little bit. I do think it is weird that in our last story arc, Dr. Shin was actually still arguing with Arthur about giving him something scientific to reveal to the world in order to clear his name and get his reputation back. But then in this arc, Dr. Shin was just completely subsumed by his guilt, and he would rather die than betray Arthur again. Is he a selfish jerk who was willing to hurt somebody close to him for personal gain? Or is he a self-sacrificing hero inspired by Arthur's heroism? The story doesn't seem to know which, but at least it's interesting, right? Black Manta, on the other hand, isn't a character in this at all. His real name doesn't matter, his feelings don't matter, what he thinks or where he came from or how he can stomach having Manta-themed lackeys isn't important to the story at all. All that matters to the story is that he is a threat. He is Aquaman's boogeyman. And he does a great job in that capacity, but still, there's no depth there. The final reason that this particular reveal doesn't work well for me is because it doesn't impact our narrative going forward. Johns has set up that Shin and Arthur have history, and that it's bad. We know this, we see this. Telling us why it's bad is neat, and thank you, but it's kind of already too late. Johns isn't showing us the fallout of that moment. It's not guiding the structure of our story right now. It's not the thing we're paying for, because it happened in the past. It's done and over with. As such, revealing this information to the audience is almost just a little bit pointless. The shared reveal of Manta and Arthur's past doesn't impact their story in this either. Again, it tells us why they hate each other, but it doesn't change what we are seeing in the comic. If anything, the story between Aquaman and Black Manta in the Others arc happens in spite of their shared history, actually. I mentioned before that Aquaman's story presents itself as being about him getting revenge on Black Manta for killing his dad, when in actuality, the story is about Arthur's self-loathing and defending his friends because he doesn't want them to die. Manta's story, meanwhile, presents as being about getting revenge on Aquaman for the death of his father, when in actuality, the story is about him doing a job. So we were told that these two men hate each other so much that they have a blood feud that goes over years, and yet they've both moved on to other things. Neither one of them actually cares. It's almost like Johns is writing against himself here. And I actually have a backup problem that occurred to me when I was putting this script together that I failed to mention. In issue 7 of Aquaman, Dr. Shin gets a phone call right before Aquaman and Mera show up to his place, right? Nobody answers on the other line, they just hang up, and I guessed that this was Prisoner. But it actually couldn't be Prisoner, or at least, very least it shouldn't be Prisoner. When Yawara first showed up in the home of Dr. Shin, she said that Arthur told the others that he killed Dr. Shin. Prisoner did not know that Dr. Shin was alive in order to be able to call him at all. So who the hell called Dr. Shin and why? From a meta perspective, I think that Johns had someone call Dr. Shin in order to make him look guilty. Remember, a bunch of people didn't trust Dr. Shin going into the other's story arc. And having set up that Shin had bad blood with Arthur, as an audience, makes us suspect him as well. We are supposed to think that he could be working with Black Manta. But then Arthur says that he trusts him from the jump! It's just plain inconsistent! The second Yawara shows up and goes, I don't trust that guy, I'm gonna have my jaguar eat him, Arthur goes, no, he's fine! We even have the scene where Arthur is spying on Manta in the dead king's tomb, and even Arthur is surprised that Shin isn't working with Manta. So which is it, Artie? Do you trust Dr. Shin or not? This right here is one of the hard parts of how Johns is writing this story. This is one of the most frustrating things to me as a reader. Because as much as the New 52 wanted to sell itself as a fresh new start for these characters and concepts, it just wasn't. We didn't start Aquaman's story at the beginning of Aquaman's adventure like Marvel's Ultimate line did back in 2000. We started this story 6 years in. And Johns has to write the book like it is brand new, like he is presenting these concepts to an audience for the first time. But as an author, he is still writing it like 6 years of history have occurred in Aquaman's backstory. Did you know that Black Manta has at least 2 different origin stories in the pre-New 52 DC continuity? I didn't. Does either one of those origins count here in the New 52 continuity? It shouldn't, but we aren't given any origin for him, so I don't know. Maybe they are in continuity. Johns has clearly put in references to Aquaman's Golden Age origin previously, so why not Black Manta? Did you know that Johns previously wrote a story in which it was revealed that Black Manta had been imprisoned by Mara's people for a time and then escaped, which would explain how he knew to counteract her hydrokinesis? Because I didn't know that from reading this story. But that story shouldn't count, right? Because this is the New 52. It's a fresh start jumping on point, and I shouldn't need to read the previous Aquaman stories in order to get this story. Unfortunately, though, Johns is forced to tell Aquaman's story this way because the rest of the DC universe is doing it too. Everything in the New 52 has started in the middle of its narrative because that's what the fans expect. But then every title also has to do these historical stories in order to establish what makes them different from the titles that came before the New 52. But that means that historical flashbacks just explain why things are without informing what is actually going on in the book itself. Author Geoff Johns is basically walking a storytelling tightrope here. On the one hand, as part of the New 52 mandate, he is treating these Aquaman comics like they're foundational. We're getting a new interpretation of his origin, we got a new cast of characters built around him, and we have been exploring his new backstory. But on the other hand, it really feels like Johns is writing these stories for an audience that has read Aquaman stories before. He is telling great, engaging stories, but he isn't giving me a really good foundation for these stories. He didn't tell us Aquaman's real name for issues. He hasn't told us Black Manta's real name at all. I don't know the story of how Aquaman and Mara met, or how Aquaman and the others met, or what it was like when Arthur was the king of Atlantis, or when he left, or why he left. Johns is writing these comics like these things already happened, like I should have already read those issues and they just don't exist. Or if they do exist, they're part of a continuity that DC should have, at least in theory, left behind. This Zero issue, as well-intentioned as it was meant to be, only helps to demonstrate how poorly DC in general, and Geoff Johns in specific, did in crafting the new universe. And despite the fact that I have just spent 20 to 30 minutes ranting about this idea, when I read these Aquaman comics, I don't notice these problems. These Aquaman comics honestly read just fine on a surface level. The story makes sense for the most part. The character work regarding Aquaman is super solid. I'll never stop saying it. The cast is great, and artistically, this book is floopin' gorgeous. Does the overall image of the comic blur a little bit when I focus on it too much? Absolutely. Does that make it a bad comic? Well, I do think that kind of mileage is going to vary per reader, but for me, I don't think so. Johns and the creative team set out to give Aquaman a cosmetic and PR-related facelift, and as far as I'm concerned, they have succeeded so far. I loved every second of the other's story arc, and I want more. I want to keep getting more of these comics. Even if Aquaman isn't perfect, even if I can rant for 20 minutes about how there's these story parts that are inconsistent or don't back each other up, or some elements of the story are a little weaker than others, I still want more of them. And that's great. Next week, Aquaman visits his half-brother Orm to follow up on the now MIA scepter that sank Atlantis. Put on your best clothes and brush up on your etiquette, everybody. We're meeting the King of Atlantis in Aquaman issue 14. Then we finally get to see how Arthur interacts with his super friends in the Justice League as we kick off our first crossover. Join me in a week for Comic Book Breakdown episode 26.10 of Aquaman, Throne of Atlantis, Part 1. Everyone, there are a million podcasts vying for your time and attention, and I'd like to thank you for listening to mine. If you would like to get in touch with me to share a concern, request a series, compliment me, berate me, whatever you like, send me an email at cbbreakdown@gmail.com. Otherwise, thanks for listening.